Welcome back to Static After Dark, the podcast where we illuminate the darkest corners of mysteries and forgotten crimes. I'm your host, Chris, and thank you for joining us for episode 2. Tonight, we're traveling back in time, back 70 years to Adelaide, South Australia, in the year 1956. We're diving deep into a case that has haunted one of Australia's major cities for nearly 7 decades. A case that remains unsolved to this day. A case where a young man's life was cut short, his family left without answers, and justice remains just out of reach. On the morning of May 19, 1956, a 21-year-old taxi driver named Kenneth Hearn was discovered dead in the front seat of his St. George's taxi. He had been shot, robbed, and left like forgotten cargo on a quiet street in Salisbury. What started as an ordinary night shift would become Kenneth's last shift. What started as a routine investigation would become one of Adelaide's most perplexing cold cases. This is the story of Kenneth Hearn. This is the story of a young man's final hours, the investigation that followed, and the mystery that refuses to be solved. This is Static After Dark. Adelaide in 1956. To understand Kenneth Hearn's story, we first need to understand the world he lived in. Adelaide, in 1956, was a very different place from what it is today. Post-World War II Australia was experiencing a period of growth and modernisation, but Adelaide was still a relatively small city compared to the metropolises of Sydney and Melbourne. It was a place where people knew their neighbourhoods, where communities were tight-knit, and where the idea of violence, particularly random street violence, was still somewhat shocking to the collective consciousness. The 1950s in Adelaide were a time of relative peace and prosperity. Families were settling into suburban homes, businesses were growing, and the city was becoming increasingly car-dependent. Taxis were an essential service in this growing city. They were the lifeline for people who needed reliable transportation, especially late at night. St. George's Taxi Company was one of Adelaide's leading cab operators. They operated a fleet of vehicles throughout the city, and their drivers worked irregular hours, picking up passengers from all parts of town at all hours of the day and night. It was honest work, the kind of work that kept the city moving. It was work that Kenneth Hearn had undertaken as his livelihood. But there was a vulnerability inherent to this work, wasn't there? Taxi drivers worked alone. They operated late at night, often in dark areas of the city. They carried cash. They picked up strangers without knowing anything about them. And they did this night after night, often without incident, but always taking a certain level of risk. That risk, that vulnerability, would become fatally apparent on the night of May 18th and the early morning of May 19th, 1956. The victim, Kenneth Hearn. Let's talk about Kenneth Hearn himself. Kenneth was 21 years old, just at the beginning of his adult life. He lived with his family on Humphreys Terrace in Woodville Gardens, Adelaide. By all accounts, Kenneth was a hard-working young man. He was the type of person who showed up on time, who did his job, who didn't attract trouble. In many ways, Kenneth was an ordinary young man living an ordinary life in ordinary Adelaide. He wasn't a notorious criminal. He wasn't a controversial figure. He was just a taxi driver trying to make a living in a city that needed people like him. He had a family who loved him. He had routines. He had a future that stretched ahead of him. Or at least, it should have. What we know about Kenneth comes to us in fragments, filtered through the recollections of his family, through newspaper articles from 1956, and through police records. We know he was employed by St. George's Taxi Company, one of Adelaide's major cab operators. We know he was conscientious enough to be trusted with a vehicle, to be sent out night after night into the city to pick up fares from all over Adelaide. The night of May 18th was just another shift for Kenneth. He did what he always did. He went to work, he took his taxi, and he began picking up passengers. There was nothing particularly unusual about that evening. There was no warning that this would be the night that changed everything. There was no indication that Kenneth Hearn's life was about to end in violence and darkness. The passengers he picked up during his shift, the places he went, the people he spoke to, these details remain largely lost to history. We only know with certainty what came at the end of that journey: death, robbery, and a mystery that would define Adelaide's criminal history. The final fare. What we do know is that at some point during the evening of May 18, 1956, Kenneth Hearn picked up a fare in Port Adelaide. Historically, this has been Adelaide's working-class hub, a place of docks, warehouses, and the kind of urban landscape that draws a diverse clientele. Someone hailed Kenneth's taxi there, someone got in, and Kenneth agreed to drive them. According to the police investigation that followed, Kenneth was driving toward Golden Grove Road in Salisbury. It's a journey that should have taken him through the suburban streets of Adelaide, past homes where families were sleeping, past quiet intersections and neighbourhood streets. But somewhere along that route, something went terribly wrong. What happened in the final moments of Kenneth's life remains unknown. Did he know something was wrong before it happened? Did the passenger suddenly become threatening? Did Kenneth try to resist? Did he attempt to escape? We simply do not know. The evidence preserved in police files and newspaper records doesn't tell us these details. What we do know is that Kenneth Hearn was shot. According to reports from the time, he was shot at close range with what was believed to be a .22 caliber bullet. This wasn't a robbery that went awry. This was an execution. This was deliberate. And then Kenneth was robbed. His money was taken. His personal effects were taken. And he was left in the front seat of his taxi, dead or dying, on Golden Grove Road in Salisbury. Left like trash. Left like he didn't matter. The discovery. Morning came to Adelaide on Saturday, May 19, 1956, just like any other morning. The sun rose. People woke up. Children got ready for the weekend. But for one person, a passerby who was travelling along Golden Grove Road in Salisbury at approximately 8 a.m., the morning was about to become a nightmare. That's when they saw it: Kenneth Hearn's body slumped in the front seat of his St. George's taxi. Try to imagine that moment. Try to imagine being the person who discovered this young man, shot dead, sitting upright in his vehicle. The shock, the horror, the immediate knowledge that something terrible had happened in this city, in this neighborhood, in this place where people thought they were safe. The discovery set off an immediate chain of events. Police were called. The crime scene was secured. Investigators began arriving at the location. Within hours, all of Adelaide was reeling from the news. A 21-year-old taxi driver had been murdered, shot in the head, robbed, left in his taxi. What should have been a routine Saturday morning had become the beginning of one of Adelaide's most intensive criminal investigations of the era. The police response was swift. They understood immediately that this was a serious crime, a shocking crime, and a crime that demanded answers. The body was photographed, evidence was collected, witnesses were identified, and within days, the investigation would expand to include dozens of interviews and countless leads. But despite all this effort, despite the urgency and the intensity of the police response, a killer, or killers, remained at large. The investigation. In the aftermath of Kenneth Hearn's murder, Adelaide was gripped by fear and urgency. Newspapers ran banner headlines: "Manhunt for murderer of SA taxi driver." The public was on edge. The question everyone was asking was simple and terrifying: who killed Kenneth Hearn, and why? Police launched what would become one of the most comprehensive investigations Adelaide had seen in years. According to newspaper reports from the time, investigators had interviewed more than 50 people within days of discovering Kenneth's body. 50 different leads, 50 different opportunities to find the person or persons responsible. These investigators had descriptions, or at least they were searching for descriptions. They had the murder weapon, a .22 caliber bullet. They had a motive, robbery. They had a location, Golden Grove Road in Salisbury. They had a timeline, late evening on May 18th into the early morning of May 19th. But here's the fundamental problem with any murder investigation, especially one in 1956. You need evidence. You need witnesses willing to talk. You need leads that go somewhere. And all of these elements were in short supply. Think about the challenges the police faced. This wasn't a murder that happened in a crowded place during the day. This happened on a quiet road, in darkness, late at night. Kenneth's last passenger, the person or people in his taxi at the moment he was killed, was the prime suspect. But who were they? Where were they? Did they have connections to Adelaide? Were they locals? Were they passing through? The nature of taxi work made this even more complicated. Taxi drivers routinely picked up people they'd never met before. Kenneth would have had no reason to be suspicious of his final fare. A taxi driver's job depends on trust, on believing that passengers are who they appear to be. And that trust, in Kenneth Hearn's case, was betrayed with violence. Furthermore, 1956 was well before the age of modern forensic science as we know it today. There was no DNA testing. There was no sophisticated fingerprint analysis as we have now. There were no digital records, no GPS tracking, no security cameras. Investigators had to rely on eyewitness testimony, on physical evidence like the bullet itself, and on old-fashioned detective work, following leads, interviewing people, hoping that someone would provide the breakthrough that would crack the case. As the weeks turned into months, the intensity of the investigation continued. But no arrest was made, no confession was given, no suspect was charged. Despite the 50-plus interviews, despite the obvious motive of robbery, despite the specificity of the crime scene and the timing, the investigation stalled. The family murders connection. Here's where Kenneth Hearn's story becomes even more troubling, even more mysterious. In the years that followed Kenneth's murder, law enforcement in South Australia began to see patterns. Patterns of violence, patterns of unsolved murders. Patterns that suggested something much darker might be happening in Adelaide. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Adelaide was terrorised by a series of horrific murders that came to be known as the family murders. I want to be very clear. The family murders occurred decades after Kenneth Hearn's death. Kenneth was murdered in 1956. The family murders happened between 1979 and 1983, more than 20 years later. But what investigators came to believe was that Kenneth's murder might have been connected to this larger pattern of violence. The family murders, as they became known, involved the kidnapping, sexual abuse, torture, and murder of at least 5 young men and teenage boys. The victims included Alan Barnes, just 16 years old, Neil Muir, 25, Peter Stogneff, only 14, Mark Langley, 18, and Richard Kelvin, 15, the son of a prominent Adelaide television news presenter. These murders were horrific. They were characterized by extreme violence, sexual assault, torture, and the deliberate disposal of bodies. Many of the victims showed signs of having been drugged. Many had been subjected to brutal injuries. Some bodies had been dissected and scattered. Others had been washed and redressed after death before being dumped. Police came to believe that the family murders were committed by a loosely connected group of individuals involved in the kidnapping and sexual abuse of young males. Only one person was ever convicted, Bevan Spencer von Einem, who was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Richard Kelvin in 1984. The other murders in the family cluster remain officially unsolved, though von Einem was long suspected in those cases as well. Now, here's the crucial question. Did Kenneth Hearn's murder connect to the family murders? Was Kenneth somehow part of this larger pattern of violence that would define Adelaide's darkest chapter? The timeline doesn't perfectly align. Kenneth's murder was in 1956, while the family murders were from 1979 to 1983. And the methodology was different. Kenneth was shot while most of the family victims were subjected to sexual violence and torture before death. However, police came to believe there might be connections. Perhaps there was a longer chain of violence stretching back further than anyone realized. Perhaps the people involved in the family murders were involved in other crimes in earlier years. Perhaps Kenneth's killer was connected to that larger circle of violence and depravity. Or perhaps, and this is also possible, Kenneth's murder was simply a robbery gone wrong, a separate incident of violence that has no connection to the family at all. Without concrete evidence linking the cases, without confessions, without solid investigative breakthroughs, we're left with speculation and theories rather than certainty. What we do know is that Crime Stoppers South Australia, in their investigation of cold cases, has listed Kenneth Hearn's murder alongside other unsolved homicides. And they've noted the possible connection to the family murders as one theory that hasn't been fully ruled out. 70 years of silence. Let that number sink in. 70 years. 70 years have passed since Kenneth Hearn was found dead in his taxi on Golden Grove Road. 70 years? That's more than 2/3 of a century. That's an entire generation, born, grown up, and grown old since Kenneth died. That's the span of time between his murder and today, and in all of that time, his case has remained unsolved. Think about what that means. It means that whoever killed Kenneth Hearn, whether it was one person or multiple people, has lived their entire life without ever facing justice for this crime. If they were young at the time, they're now old. If they were middle-aged, they may no longer be alive. But whether they're still living or whether they've passed on, they've carried this secret with them for 7 decades. That's an enormous burden of secrecy. That's an enormous weight of guilt, assuming there's any conscience at all in the person responsible. 70 years also means that memories fade. Witnesses who might have seen something have grown old or passed away. Evidence that might have been preserved has been lost or destroyed. The city of Adelaide itself has changed dramatically. The streets where Kenneth drove are different now. The neighborhoods have evolved. The world has transformed completely. In 1956, the world was still recovering from World War II. Television was new, commercial aviation was just becoming routine. Nobody had heard of computers or the internet. Nobody carried cameras in their pockets or recorded everything they saw. Now, in 2026, we live in a world of surveillance, technology, and instant communication. We live in a world where crimes are often solved through digital evidence, through DNA analysis, through forensic technology that didn't exist in Kenneth's time. And yet, despite all our modern capabilities, despite all our technological advancement, despite the passage of time that might have loosened someone's tongue, Kenneth Hearn's murder remains officially unsolved. Over the years, cold case units have periodically reviewed the file. Crime Stoppers South Australia has kept the case alive, creating profiles of Kenneth, circulating his story, reaching out to the public in hopes that someone, anyone, might come forward with information that could finally solve this mystery. Rewards have been offered, appeals have been made, but the case has remained stubbornly cold. What happened to Kenneth Hearn that night? Who picked him up in Port Adelaide? Why were they getting into a taxi? Was it a robbery that was planned in advance, or was it opportunistic? Someone who saw a taxi driver as an easy target? Was Kenneth killed because he resisted, or was he killed to silence him? Was there one killer or two or more? These questions have gone unanswered for 70 years. The impact on family and community. We tend to think of crime statistics in abstract terms. We talk about murder rates and cold cases and unsolved crimes as though they're just numbers in a database. But behind every statistic is a human being. Behind every cold case is a family that has lived with grief for decades. Kenneth Hearn's family experienced a wound that never fully healed. Imagine being a parent and losing your 21-year-old son to violence. The shock, the horror, the desperate search for answers. Attending your son's funeral, knowing that his killer is still out there. Imagine living the rest of your life knowing that justice was never served. Kenneth's siblings had to grow up in the shadow of this crime. They had to live with the knowledge that their brother had been murdered, that a killer was never caught, that there was never closure or resolution. That's a trauma that echoes through generations. And this wasn't just a tragedy for Kenneth's immediate family. It was a tragedy for the entire Adelaide community. Kenneth's murder sent shockwaves through the city. It highlighted the vulnerability of workers like taxi drivers. It sparked conversations about safety, about the dangers of certain professions, about the darkness that could hide beneath the surface of ordinary life. For taxi drivers in Adelaide, Kenneth's murder was a wake-up call. It demonstrated that even in a supposedly safe city, even in daylight-adjacent hours, danger could strike suddenly and without warning. It changed how people thought about the job. It made people aware that the person they were picking up could be anyone, could mean harm, and could end their life. For parents, Kenneth's murder became part of the cultural conversation about danger in the city. It became a cautionary tale about the risks young people faced, about the unpredictability of violence. And for Adelaide as a whole, Kenneth's murder became part of the city's identity, one of the dark chapters in its history that residents would remember and discuss for decades to come. Adelaide would later become known in true crime circles for the family murders and other serious crimes. But Kenneth Hearn's murder was part of that narrative, part of Adelaide's reputation as a place where terrible things had happened, where unsolved murders cast long shadows. 70 years later, Kenneth's family would still be seeking answers. They still wonder who killed their loved one. They still wonder why justice was never served. And for a victim's family, that lack of closure is its own kind of ongoing death, a grief that never fully resolves. The investigative dead ends. One of the most frustrating aspects of cold cases is understanding why they remain unsolved despite best efforts. Kenneth Hearn's case had several strikes against it from the beginning. First, there was the lack of concrete forensic evidence by modern standards. The bullet was recovered, but .22 caliber bullets are extremely common. Without matching them to a specific weapon, something that requires either finding the weapon or having a suspect to match it to, the bullet is simply a piece of evidence without context. Second, there was the lack of eyewitnesses who were willing or able to come forward with specific information. Yes, 50 people were interviewed, but interviews don't necessarily mean 50 people saw something relevant to the crime. Most of those 50 were likely routine interviews, people who knew Kenneth, people who might have seen his taxi, people on the periphery of the investigation. The actual eyewitness to Kenneth's final moments, the person or people who were in the taxi with him, had every reason not to come forward. They were, in all likelihood, the killer or killers. They had already murdered once. What would compel them to turn themselves in? Third, there was the matter of motive and opportunity. Robbery appeared to be the motive, which cast a wide net. How many people in Adelaide in 1956 might have been desperate enough to rob a taxi driver? Potentially thousands. Without additional evidence linking a specific person to the crime, the motive alone wasn't enough to solve the case. Fourth, there was the timing and location. Golden Grove Road in Salisbury was not a major thoroughfare in 1956. It wasn't a place where there would have been multiple witnesses or surveillance of any kind. It was a quiet area where someone could commit a crime and reasonably expect not to be seen. Over the decades, investigative techniques improved. DNA technology emerged. Digital databases were created. Cold case units were established specifically to revisit old cases with fresh eyes and new technology. But by then, much of the physical evidence may have been lost or degraded. Witnesses had aged or passed away. The case had grown cold in every sense of the word. And so Kenneth Hearn's murder remains unsolved, not because there wasn't an investigation, not because the case wasn't taken seriously, but because the fundamental pieces of evidence and testimony needed to solve it were never found, or if they existed, have been lost to time. The unanswered questions. As we approach the end of our examination of Kenneth Hearn's case, we're left with questions that may never be answered. Who was Kenneth Hearn's final passenger? Was it someone he knew or a stranger? Did they flag him down specifically because he was a taxi driver? Or did they simply see an available cab and hail him? What was the conversation like during that final ride? Did Kenneth sense that something was wrong? Did he try to communicate with the killer before the violence started? Did he try to escape? Was Kenneth's murder truly connected to the family murders, or is that connection merely speculation? What role, if any, did organized crime or gang activity play in his death? Most importantly, is there someone out there who knows what happened that night? Someone who was there, either as a perpetrator or as a witness? Someone who has carried this knowledge, this secret for 70 years? These are the questions that haunt Kenneth Hearn's case. These are the questions that keep investigators and true crime enthusiasts engaged with this murder, even all these decades later. These are the questions that Kenneth's family still wants answered. And these are the questions that can only be answered if someone, somewhere, decides that justice matters more than silence. If someone decides that 70 years is long enough to keep a secret, if someone decides that a 21-year-old taxi driver deserves to have his killer identified and brought to account, even if the statute of limitations on prosecution might have expired. Adelaide's darker chapters. Kenneth Hearn's murder, while tragic and unsolved, exists within a broader context of Adelaide's criminal history. Adelaide has a reputation, in true crime circles, as a place where terrible things happen, where innocent people disappear, where killers evade justice for decades. The disappearance of the Beaumont children in 1966, 3 young siblings who vanished from an Adelaide beach and were never found. That tragedy sent shockwaves through the entire nation and became a defining moment in Australian criminal history. The Truro murders of the late 1970s, in which 7 women were murdered in a shocking crime spree by Christopher Worrell. The case only became fully understood after Worrell died in a car accident, taking many details to his grave. The disappearance of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirsta Gordon in 1973, 2 young girls who vanished from a football match and were never located. And then, of course, the family murders, that horrific series of sexually motivated kidnappings, tortures, and murders that terrorized Adelaide in the 1979 to 1983 period. Adelaide has come to be known, in certain circles, as a place of mystery and darkness. Whether Kenneth Hearn's case is connected to these other crimes, or whether it stands alone, his murder is part of that darker chapter of Adelaide's history. His story is part of the reason why Adelaide occupies a certain place in Australia's true crime landscape. And yet, Adelaide is also a thriving, modern city. It's a place of culture and commerce, and ordinary families going about their ordinary lives. The crimes of the past don't define the entire city or its people. But they do cast a shadow. They do remind us that darkness can exist anywhere, that violence can touch anyone, and that some mysteries may never be fully resolved. That is the story of Kenneth Hearn, a young taxi driver whose life was cut short on a quiet road in Salisbury, South Australia. A young man who deserved so much more than what fate dealt him. A young man who deserves to be remembered, not just as a cold case statistic, but as a person with a name, a family, and a future that was stolen from him. For 70 years, Kenneth's murder has remained unsolved. For 70 years, his family has waited for justice. For 70 years, Adelaide has carried the weight of this mystery. Thank you for joining us here at Static After Dark as we've explored this tragic chapter of Australian criminal history. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, to remember Kenneth's story, and to think about the mysteries that linger in the shadows all around us. If you found this episode compelling, we genuinely hope you'll join us for more investigations into cases that deserve our attention. You can find Static After Dark on all major podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite shows. Search for Static After Dark and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a review if you enjoy the show. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. But here's what's truly important. If you have any information about Kenneth Hearn's murder, or if you know anything about the circumstances surrounding his death on May 19, 1956, please reach out. You can contact Crime Stoppers South Australia. They take tips confidentially, and you can provide information anonymously. Your identity will be protected. Your information will be taken seriously. A crime doesn't have a statute of limitations on being solved. Even 70 years later, even if the original perpetrators have passed away, solving Kenneth's murder would bring closure to his family. It would answer questions that have gone unanswered for generations. It would finally give Kenneth Hearn the justice he deserves. You can reach Crime Stoppers South Australia by phone, or you can visit their website at crimestoppersa.com.au. You can provide information online, by phone, or in person. Whatever method you choose, your information could be the key that finally solves this 70-year-old mystery. A young man deserves to have his story heard. A family deserves answers, and justice, real, meaningful justice, deserves a chance, even after all these years. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep the stories of the forgotten and the unsolved alive. This has been Static After Dark. We'll see you in the darkness.